tithing and sowing seeds and all that crazy mess and everything. And I was like, and it just popped your eyes open, and you're like, well, no, I'm sitting here thinking that, the curse is going to be lifted off of me because I'm getting my tithes and everything, and that you're going to reap a financial harvest and all this stuff, and I'm like, wait a minute, you don't see that anywhere in the Bible. And they have some kind of excuse to cover all bases. Like if you come to them and say, well, I've been paying my tithe, I've been paying my offerings for 20, 30 years. Well,
yeah.
Don't speak now. Don't speak that.
I get so upset when they say, well, Jesus taught tithing, therefore tithing is taught in the New Testament. Well, we may call it the New Testament, but the New Testament doesn't begin until Jesus says on the cross, it is finished. Yeah. And when Jesus is saying, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, he's not addressing the Christian church. He's addressing scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Yeah, and he said, you tithe mint and cumin. Oh, they were still tithing only food. Well, I'm right to that part of the text. Right. And you ignore the weightier matters of the law. Well, they act like that word matters of the law is not even in the Bible. Jesus is not discussing matters of grace to the Christian church. He's discussing matters of the law to those who are breaking the law. So the verse itself destroys their own argument.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard this one, because I've heard this taught. When Jesus says, except your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, I've heard it taught that your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees because they say, well, what was the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees? Well, they paid tithes. So that means you got to give, a seed or something like that and everything. And I'm like, I don't see that in that scripture, that you have to do, some would say you have to do more than the tithe.
The Bible teaches that the only people who were required to give a minimum of 10% were food producers who lived inside Israel, period. Therefore, it was not a minimum for everybody in the world. It wasn't even a minimum for people in Israel who were not food producers. Jesus was a carpenter. Peter was a fisherman. Paul was a tent maker. None of those qualified if they lived inside Israel as a tithe payer. They had no food to tithe. There was 3 tithes in the Old Testament. The first was the Levitical tithe that went to the Levitical cities, and the Levites shared a tenth of that with the priest. The second tithe was a festival tithe that was brought to the streets of Jerusalem 3 times a year during the festivals and eaten by everybody. Now, if you didn't have a wagon and a horse cart and didn't have any way of carrying that food into Jerusalem, you were allowed to convert the tithes into money, and when you got to Jerusalem, turn it back into food and eat it. So the second tithe was eaten by the people in the streets of Jerusalem. Now there was every 3 years there was a poor tithe, a third-year tithe, in which you kept a separate tithe in your house, in the towns where they lived. And when somebody knocked on your door this poor, you'd have something to give them. So if you add those 3 up, you got probably the total tithe was really about 23%.
Wow.
First tithe is Leviticus 27, 30 to 34, and Numbers 18, 21 to 28. So they went to 3 different people, 3 different locations, and it's clear that they were 3 separate tithes to me. A lot of people would argue about that movement. But if there was only one tithe, it's still not biblical. Yeah, I don't like getting tied, in a big argument about how many tithes there were.
Was tithing ever money?
No.